மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Welcome back to chapter 2 in the course, and in this video we're going to be focusing on the theme of deflection. Now, deflection tactics are very similar to attraction tactics, like we saw in the previous chapter. Now, with attractions, the whole idea was to lure enemy pieces to a specific square. But with deflections, the point is to lure enemy pieces away from defending key squares, meaning a piece could be defending against a possible mate threat, or a piece could be defending another piece, and the whole idea behind deflections is to lure that piece away from whatever defensive task it is currently doing. Once again, deflections tend to be very forcing, and often by way of sacrifice, we're able to pull enemy pieces away from performing some kind of key defensive role. Now, there are many different cases where deflection tactics can be really strong, and as you solve puzzles throughout this chapter, you'll hopefully become better at spotting these opportunities for yourself. So for our first instructive example here, we have a really nice study composed by the great Russian Alexei Trotsky, really one of the great composers of all time. And here it is white to play and win. Now, black is currently up a queen, but black's king is in a little bit of danger. And the main thing that white needs to notice to solve this puzzle is to realize that the move knight to e3 is a potential mate threat. Currently, this square is covered by black's queen. But if white was able to play knight e3 safely, that would not only check the king, but also take away the main escape square from the king, delivering checkmate. So now the question becomes, how do we deflect black's queen away from defending this key square? And this is where we need some kind of deflection tactic. So the right move here is a really strong move, rook to b7. Hitting black's queen, and of course hoping that the queen will take the rook on b7 so that white can play knight e3 checkmate. But this move rook b7 also comes with a second threat, and that is to go rook to g7 check, which would force black to play king to f5, and then rook to g5 is actually going to be mate on the board, since white's knight on d5 is covering f6 and f4 away from black's king. So this move rook to b7 actually comes with two threats, hitting the queen and threatening this mate in two with rook to g7 check, but it seems like black can defend against both threats with the move queen to d4, covering the g7 square. So the main thing to notice here is that black's queen is still tied down to defending the e3 square as well as the g7 square. And when a piece is defending multiple squares, that often means that that piece is overloaded or overworked, and you can take advantage by trying to stretch the defenses of that piece and trying to unleash both threats against the opponent. And so here white wins with a really strong move, rook to g7 check. At first glance, it seems like this rook is just hanging, but if black plays queen takes g7, then white finally gets the mate with knight to e3, and the game is over. But if black does not take this rook, the only other move is to play king to f5, and after rook to g5, we have a nice checkmate on the board. So after this move rook to g7 check, unfortunately for black, there's nothing to do. The king is in check, and if the queen takes, black gets mated on the e3 square. And this puzzle hopefully shows the power of recognizing when your opponent's pieces are tied down to defending key squares, as you can then take advantage. It's very easy to dismiss this move rook to g7 check, or to not even consider it because we see that the rook is hanging. It's really, really important to train yourself to push past that and learn to recognize when a piece is tied down to a specific square and cannot leave defense of that square, like the queen here could not leave the defense of the e3 square. And this threat rook to g7 is the reason why the other try in this position, let's say white tried the move rook to a4, doesn't quite work. The rook on a4 would be immune, as black's queen cannot take in view of knight e3 mate, but since this move doesn't come with a second threat, black could play a move like queen to c5, for example, keep the e3 square under control, and white would have no good way of winning the game. If rook a5, black can continue ignoring this rook and just keeping the queen on this diagonal. So that's why this move rook to b7 is such a strong move and not only hits the queen, but it also introduces a second threat into the position, going after and trying to checkmate black's king. So with that, let's take a look at our next example. Our next example here is a typical puzzle that you might see throughout this chapter. Here it is white to play and win, and I would really encourage you to try and solve this one on your own. I think it's very doable, but make sure to pause the video and think for at least a few minutes if you're not able to solve it. So here white has an extra pawn in a rook endgame, which normally is not quite enough to win, but white is actually able to transition into a winning king and pawn endgame with a nice deflection idea. And that is starting with the move rook to f7 check, hitting black's king, which is of course defending the rook on h6 and forcing a trade of rooks. Now white doesn't actually win any material here, but after king takes f7, king takes h6, what we have is a king and pawn endgame where white's king is in front of the pawn on g4, and white is actually going to be able to win this one from here. If you're not super familiar with king and pawn endgames, they're very, very critical to study. And it's really important to understand when we're winning in a king and pawn endgame and when the enemy is able to defend. And here, because white's king is so far advanced, black's king is just not going to be able to hold this one. For example, after king to g8, white can play king to g6, taking the opposition. And once the king gets out of the way, white's king can advance to h7, followed by pushing the pawn forward. And since white's king is covering all three of these squares, there's nothing that the black king can do here. White's pawn is just advancing freely, and white is going to be promoting a new queen and winning the game. So once again, this move rook f7 check doesn't actually win any material, it just forces a trade of rooks, but it allows white to transition into a winning king and pawn endgame, and was thus the only way to win the game. Any other move where white keeps the rooks on the board, black is going to be able to hold that really easily. It's really important to spot these opportunities, not just in puzzles, but also in your games, when you're able to trade off that final set of pieces and leave yourself with a winning king and pawn endgame. Our next example here is actually puzzle number 7 from the chapter, and once again, it is white to play and win, and I'll invite you to pause the video now and try to solve it on your own. So here both sides have their passed pawns, and in fact it looks like black is about to promote with the f-pawn being super far advanced here. So that means that white has to be very quick in forcing in order to find the win. And here white is able to win with the really nice move bishop a7 check, sacrificing the bishop in order to lure black's king away from this b8 square, where we'll no longer defend the c7 square that white's king wants to advance to. After king takes a7, which is absolutely forced, white plays king to c7. Now the point is that white is going to be promoting next move with check. And once white promotes, black's king is going to be forced to play king to a6. White is going to have queen b6 checkmate. So for example, black might promote the pawn with f1 equals queen. There's nothing really better. The knight is too far away to do anything. White, unfortunately for black, promotes with check. And after king a6, queen b6, white has mate on the board. So a very forcing solution, starting with this move bishop a7 check, once again forcing black's king away from being able to blockade our passed pawn and allowing white's king to advance to this critical 7th rank where it can help our pawn promote. This is another very typical tactic that comes up in lots of endgame studies and the endgame in general when we're trying to force our passed pawn through. So whenever you have a far advanced passed pawn, it's really, really important to look for these kinds of deflection tactics in order to help get your pawn to promotion. So with that, folks, I'll leave you to solve the rest of the puzzles in this chapter on your own. Once again, I would recommend spending up to 5 minutes per puzzle, more if you need to, and to really make sure that you're reviewing the solution of all the puzzles that you get wrong. This is really the way to strengthen your overall tactical understanding of some of these ideas and to really build up your pattern recognition for the future. With that, I'll wish you the best of luck, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Take care.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.